2 Timothy in chapter number 3, the Bible tells us here these are end time verses, I believe. Verse 1, this shall also in the last days perilous times shall come. And then it begins to list that. In 2 Timothy chapter number 3, a verse that's tucked away in there, but I think we often overlook it. Verse number 13, lucky number 13. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. At the end time, increase of men being deceived and deceiving. So I want to bring up this front screen, and I want to say a couple words very, very quickly as we talk about 9/11, coming up to 9/11. The first thing I want to say by way of introduction is that this is not in any way to deny or to belittle the fact that over 3,000 people died on that day. I do believe with all of my heart that a multiplicity of people died. We're not going to be covering all that took place that day. But there were people that died in the plane crash, Flight 93 in Shanksville. We'll talk a little bit about that. There were people that died at the Pentagon, and there were thousands of people that died on that day. We're not denigrating that or denying that at all. Secondly, we're not belittling the military, the law enforcement, firefighters, first responders, the police. I was rewatching some video this afternoon, and say what you want about New Yorkers, one of the bravest set of people there were those firemen that were taking off. And I think that what happened, and we'll get into this a little bit, but I think when you get below the level, when you get below the hierarchy and you get to the rank and file, I think there were some real heroes that day. And then even since then, the wars that we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq, then we've lost people in Libya, we've lost people in Syria, we've lost thousands of men and women. And I'm not denigrating or belittling what they have done at all. So this is not your Alex Jones sort of a thing at all. But I do want us to be good biblical citizens. And I believe good citizens question their government. There's an old saying, and I can't attribute the quote exactly right now, but it says, people should not fear their government, government should fear their people.
Yeah, man.
And I believe it is the responsibility of a citizen to question their government and to make sure that the story that we're being told is true. And I think we're long past the point of holding people in power accountable, but we should hold our people accountable. And part of what we do here on Sunday night is a pursuit of truth. You know that. We've covered a lot of material. And so we are trying to pursue truth with the ideology of how does a Christian live in this fallen world. And as I look at these young eyes and I look at the young people that we have here, I can only imagine the world that they're going to grow up in. I think it is important that they understand that the Bible and reason and truth answers to the things that they're going to face in their life. So I want to talk to you for just a moment. The Bible says here in Matthew chapter 28 verse 13, when Jesus rose from the dead, say ye his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept. Somebody said, I can't believe that as a Christian you would be involved in conspiracy theories. Man, our faith was born in conspiracy theory. I mean, it was born in that. Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and immediately there was a conspiracy theory that said, well, let's figure out how to cover up the truth. Because the truth that would come out was going to hurt the political power, it was going to hurt the social power, and it was going to hurt the religious power. And that has not changed for 2,000 years. So Christianity is not something that tiptoes around. Man, we live, breathe, eat, sleep, and we have lived in this conspiracy for a long time. And what's interesting is that the Bible says you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Now, on this verse right here in Luke chapter number 4, the Bible says that Satan was speaking to Jesus and trying to get Jesus to bow before him and to worship him. And Satan made a statement to Jesus. He said, all this power will I give thee, and the glory of them, talking about the kingdoms of the world. For that is delivered unto me, and to whomsoever I will give it. Now it is very, very important that you and I understand that that is the reality that we live in. Either that verse is true or it's not. All scripture is given by inspiration of God. And if you believe John chapter number 3 verse 16, and you should, and if you believe Genesis chapter number 1 verse 1, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, if you believe that, and you should, why would you not believe this right here? We lull ourselves into a comfort idea of thinking that the world just operates by the seen, but it doesn't. There was a man that wrote a book years ago named Epperson called The Unseen Hand. And in the beginning of his book, the preface of his book, he talked about that there are really only two ways of looking at the world. One, everything happens by accident, or B, at some level, to some degree, there is conspiracy, there is a plan put together, and the truth of the matter is, as Christians, we see that. Again, I don't want to belabor this point, but there was a conspiracy theory in the Garden of Eden. Satan came to Eve, and Eve and Satan had a conspiracy. And we see that all the way through. So from when we're talking about conspiracy theory, we're looking at it not from a political point of view. I'm going to tell you right now that if you're looking at the end of this thing for us to do some sort of tea party, all that stuff, I'm done with that stuff. Man. I think you ought to vote. I think you ought to be consistent, a good citizen. But that's not what's going to change the world. Listen to me very closely. This world is not going to change. It isn't. This world is what it is, and our job is to witness and to work, but it is not going to change. Now, let's go to the next slide, and I want to move forward just a little bit. There's a verse in the book of Luke, chapter number 16, that says, the children of this world are in their generations wiser than the children of light. One of the things that's interesting is that when you look at the world, there seems to be an openness to the reality of conspiracy, to the reality of a dual nature. But Christians close that off, especially modern American Christians. We seem to close that off. But in reality, you have to make a choice about what you're going to live in, whether in fantasy or in reality.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
Do we have a deal, Mr. Reagan?
You know, I know this steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss.
Then we have a deal.
I don't want to remember nothing. Nothing. You understand? And I want to be rich. You know, someone important. Like an actor.
Whatever you want, Mr. Reagan.
How many of you want steak now? If you couldn't hear what he was saying, the first part of The Matrix, which is an interesting study all on its own, you ought to read and research a little bit about the Matrix movies. The first part is offering to the main character an opportunity to stay asleep or to awake and see what's really out there. This guy had been awakened, and he realized that it was a rough and difficult world. He was sitting there at the table and he said, you know what? My brain is just telling me what this should taste like. I know it's not real. But after 9 years of living in the world, ignorance is bliss. I want to go back into the Matrix. And then he says, I want to go back, I want to be rich, and I want to be somebody important, like an actor. And so it sort of is that play on that. So what's happening here is that the children of this world, the reason that conspiracy theory is jumping ahead is because what we have seen is an increase in the ability for the common man to access information. Let me say that again. The reason that there is more insight into this is because the common man, thanks to the internet, has access to information that we have never had before. Now, another sort of a revolution like this took place when the Gutenberg printing press put the copy of the scriptures in the average man's hand. That blew up the world as we know it. But here along comes the information highway, which allows regular people like you and me to access, and not just in the web the surface web, we're talking about the deep web, the dark web. There is a lot of information that you and I have not been privy to before. And Daniel told us about this. Maybe make a note in your own Bible or in your own notes, but in Daniel chapter number 12, verse 4, the Bible says that at the end time, knowledge shall be increased. We are living in a time now where there is more knowledge than there has ever been before. And so there really are two kinds of people. There's the kind of people that want to know and the kinds of people that don't want to know. Let's go to the next one. Now, there are and always has been, very important, if you don't get this slide right here, you won't get anything else that we're going to. There is and always has been two parallel worlds living side by side. Over here, I think today started football. Is that right? I think the football season started today. Over here we have the Super Bowl, and of course the Patriots have a conspiracy to win that one. Yeah. And then you have the World Series, the Yankees, they're of the devil. And you have social media and vacations and 4th of July cookouts. You have elections, that's debatable. And then you have TV and movies. You got all this regular world over here on this side. But living side by side in the world in which you and I live is a world of conspiracy. Not debatable fact. We got into the war in Vietnam through the Gulf of Tonkin. You read about it. A pure fabrication to get us into that war. MK Ultra, that is undeniable. They have admitted to that program. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment. How many of you heard about that in high school? Okay, a number of freaks in the church. Okay. U.S. government intentionally infecting Guatemalan institutionalized mental patients with STDs. Did you know that? So much so that we actually officially apologized. I believe it was Bill Clinton.
Hillary.
Was it who?
Hillary.
Well, either one
Same
of those
thing.
Clintons would know about STD. We intentionally infected Guatemalan institutionalized mental patients. It's a fact. How many of you ever heard of the Verona Papers or Operation Northwoods? If you've heard of Operation Northwoods, raise your hand. Same set of, okay. And the Venona Papers. How many of you ever heard of the Venona Papers? A few.
All right, well, we're going to start with some breaking news, an NBC exclusive, and frankly, a stunning disclosure from the federal government about medical experiments the U.S. conducted on unknowing patients back in the 1940s. Today, officials at the very highest levels of government will apologize. Robert Bazell is NBC's chief science and health correspondent. He has this exclusive story. Robert, good morning.
Good morning, Savannah and Chuck. The officials who will do the apologizing include Secretary of State Clinton and Health and Human Services Secretary Sebelius. From 1946 to 1948, officials with the U.S. Public Health Service injected gonorrhea and syphilis as part of an experiment into people in Guatemala without their permission or consent on African American men. And of course, this incident inevitably raises comparisons with that horrible incident, where from 1932 until press reports revealed that it was going on in 1972, U.S. government doctors were telling these African American men that they were treating them for syphilis when in fact they were withholding treatment. So this is a very similar event, although it occurred in Guatemala on Guatemalans. There'll be a lot of apologizing to the nation of Guatemala and to Hispanic residents of the United States.
Now, if you couldn't hear everything, you can play it back at your own convenience. But did you hear what was going on there? Intentional poisoning of people by the United States government. The intentional withholding of medicine by the United States government. Not Russia, not communists, not Red China, your government. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So we should question our government. We should not just believe what they say. It's not as if we're coming out of nowhere by going, you know what, I'm not 100% sure that you're telling me the truth, or I want to verify, when we already have historical data that they have done these kind of things. The Venona Papers. How many have ever heard of McCarthy, Joseph McCarthy? If you have, say amen. All right. Joseph McCarthy was maligned. He's a nut job. He was crazy. There weren't communists in our government. There weren't communists. Oh, but there were. Long after he was dead, in his name, what do you call somebody if they're going after some? They're a McCarthyite, right? All that. But there were. In 1995, the U.S. National Security Agency broke a half-century of silence by releasing translations of Soviet cables decrypted back in the 1940s by the Venona Project. Venona was a top-secret U.S. effort to gather and decrypt messages sent in the 1940s by agents of what is now called the KGB, the Soviet Military Intelligence Agency. The cables revealed the identities of numerous Americans who were spies for the Soviet Union. You need to read the book Blacklisted by History. This verified almost to a T everything that McCarthy was saying. But when you as a student open up your book and you study history, all you hear is that he was a horrible man, went after people. Oh, but he was right.
Yeah.
Why did our government keep silence about that for 40 years? We have a right to question our government, and we have a right to hold them responsible. So let's go to one last example here, because I'm setting the table, because this is not people just sitting around going, you know, we ain't got anything better to do. Let's just come up with a conspiracy theory. No. We have a history. And I don't want to burst your bubble. I thank God for our nation. I thank God for the freedom. I don't want to move to Haiti. I don't want to move somewhere else.
Amen.
But I don't want to close a blind eye to the reality. If you've ever heard of Operation Northwoods, in 1997, the JFK Assassination Record Review Board released a set of records, and in 1962 there was a document called Justification for Military Intervention in Cuba. See, the nation at the time was war-weary. She'd already been through World War I, already been into World War II, spilled countless gallons of blood in North Korea. We just didn't have any desire to go somewhere else and be involved in another war, certainly with a group that could possibly nuke us. How do we justify getting our military? There was a memorandum called Operation Northwoods. It was a plan to create false attacks. U.S. military bases, U.S. citizens, defected Cubans, all designed to appear to be conducted by Cuba. This action was known as a false flag. How many of you have heard of the term false flag? That's where it comes from. It would be used to garner the public and political support necessary for a direct military intervention in the Middle East. I'm sorry, Cuba.
Right.
I'll let you do your own research on what kind of methods they were going to use. And it's very eerily similar to what happened 9/11. Now, when we look at these things, we have to ask ourselves, what is the official story? Very simply, you can get really, really complicated, but what is the official story? The impact of two planes and fires that they caused weakened the Twin Towers to the point where gravity pulled them down. You can add to that, but in essence, when you and I this week watch the video and we see those towers come down, the lives that were lost and the trauma that took place, what we're told is that two planes flown by terrorists hit that twin tower, the South Tower and the North Tower. They burned so intensely that it weakened the interior structure, and each of them collapsed at free fall speed by gravity, and that's what pulled them down. However, there are problems with this official narrative. 19 Muslim men who were not trained hijacked 4 planes without being videotaped. There is no released videotape of those men that we know being involved, going through and all of that. Very, very little bit here or there, grainy. But in airports and all that, very little videotape of them. They hit the World Trade Center towers in the Pentagon. The jet fuel burned so hotly at the World Trade Center that it melted the steel beams, causing a free fall. All of this was planned and orchestrated by Osama bin Laden from Afghanistan. Now, there's a real problem with that. And we're going to cover some of these problems as we move forward. Let's go to this next slide just very quickly so that you know it's not exactly Pastor Tillis. John Farmer, Senior Counsel to the 9/11 Commission. Not Pastor Tillis, not Alex Jones, not some nut job with a tin hat on, aluminum foil hat on. No, the Senior Counsel said at some level of the government, at some point there was an agreement not to tell the truth about what happened. We're going to ask some questions tonight. I may not give you all the answers, but I'm going to ask some questions, and we'll go through these very quickly. The official narrative just doesn't drive. The first thing that 9/11 did was change the way the world lives. Now, those of you, can you remember what it was like before 9/11? Can you really? I won't go through each of these, but the U.S. has been in a constant state of war, and yet, does anybody recall a declaration of war ever given on Afghanistan? Has there ever been a declaration of war ever given on Iraq? How can you declare war on terror? It doesn't make sense. But we have been in a constant state of war. And again, I'm not judging the men and the women that are giving their lives. I'm judging the men and women who are sending those lives off to pay the ultimate sacrifice. We have been in a constant state of war. Over 2,400 in Afghanistan alone. And you begin to go down through here. Total 6,000 over 500,000 people. When you start looking at all the humanitarian and all the contractors and all the DOD and all the U.S. military, all the innocent civilians, over 500,000 people. We have been in a constant state of war. Have we won the war? Do we know that we won the war? Is there any parameter on how that we know the war? And it always seems that just about the time we get over it, finally we get Osama bin Laden, finally we get the Taliban, and oops, now comes ISIS. Where did ISIS come from? Finally whipped ISIS, and then we find out that now we're back with the Taliban. I thought we fought the Taliban, but Trump was going to meet with the Taliban. Did you read that in the paper? Let's go to the next slide. 9/11 produced a constant state of war. 9/11 produced the Patriot Act. Anybody in here that knows their history or understands the concept of the United States of America knows that this is absolutely garbage. It eviscerated the Bill of Rights. You never trade your freedom for your safety. The Patriot Act, just weeks after September 11th, passed, providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism acts. It issued, one of them, for instance, issued by the FBI without judge's approval to obtain personal information. Do you remember years ago when they were talking about warrantless wiretapping and how silly that was? Nobody's doing that. Oops, they were. You can now be designated as a combatant terrorist and be held without due process, which is something that we value as citizens of the United States of America. 190,000 plus NSLs were issued between 2003 and 2006 with only one terror-related conviction, which would have happened without the Patriot Act. I believe that the Patriot Act had absolutely nothing to do with the war on terror. It had to do with changing the way that our government operates with civilians. That's what I believe. Let's go to the next one very quickly. And let me tell you something, I'm not a super big fan of Julian Assange and Snowden, but they were right. WikiLeaks was right. Snowden was right. There was a lot more information that we weren't being told. So let's now get down to the nuts and bolts. Everybody still with me, yes or no? Let's now get down to the nuts and bolts of our problem. These twin towers were brought down, we're told, by gravity, but the problem is nothing ever falls in the path of greatest resistance. When those twin towers fell, we're told, and we'll get into this a little bit later on, but we're told that they pancaked down. But that just doesn't fly. It just doesn't hold water. We're going to play a video here for you, and if you'll watch very, very closely, you'll notice that there is this straight line, the corner of the building, perpendicular. You'll notice that there is a straight edge that runs up behind the smoke and the straight edge here. You and I were told that what brings, can everybody see my laser pointer here? Yeah. We were told that what brings this section and everything under it down was this section falling directly in its path, pancaking it. Well, let's see if that's what happens. Watch it very closely. All right, this line here, watch it again. Oh, right there. Watch it, stop. Is that going straight down? I won't ask you the degree, but look at it again. Is that going straight down? It must be going straight down to create the pancake effect, but it is not. I would argue that that's at least a 10%, a 10-degree angle off as it's going. It is not falling straight down, and yet it's causing that pancake that we're seeing. Both of those buildings would have had to fall in the exact same way. But there is video evidence right there that that building is not falling straight down. It is at a minimum the top part tilting over. At a minimum. And that's all that it would take to undo that. Let's go to the next problem. Problem number 2. Fires don't suddenly destroy entire buildings evenly and completely. Okay. That is not being burned to the ground. That building across the top of the horizon falls at a dead even fall. No tilt, no angle. That fire had to burn completely through and do it at the exact same time in a huge building. We're not talking about a piece of wood being burned through. We're talking about a huge multi-story building, and that thing fell at an exact even rate. Problem number 3. Many steel frame high-rises have experienced much larger, hotter, and longer-lasting fires, and not a single one has collapsed. This one burned for over 18 hours. The One Meridian Plaza burned for over 18 hours. Never collapsed. The Hotel Mandarin Oriental burned for over 3 hours. Can you see the consumption of that building? Never collapsed. Did you know that the Empire State Building was hit by a B-25 bomber? How many of you knew that? Raise your hand. A few of you. The first time in history that a building was hit was not 9/11. A B-25 hit that thing and blew up. Let's play the clip.
The world's biggest skyscraper, New York's 1,248-foot-high Empire State Building, and a Mitchell bomber flying blind in a fog haze, chief actors in one of the strangest tragedies of the air. With visibility down almost to zero, traveling at 200 miles an hour, the bomber crashed with terrific impact into the 78th and 79th floors of the building, smashing through 7 walls. "13 people at work in offices were killed instantly, 26 were injured. A lift crashed down 80 floors, killing the occupants, and one man's body was found on a ledge 7 stories down. 2 days later, the 102-story building reopened, but the hole ripped in the Empire State remains a warning of the perils of low flying among skyscrapers."
Now, do you think that the Empire State Building had the sprinkler system that the Twin Towers had? Do you think that her beams were coated with the fire-resistant and fire-retardant material that the Twin Towers were? Do you think that the fire department then had an easier, quicker, better method of getting there and putting the fire out? No, absolutely not. And yet 2 days later, it's interesting that that did not go, I want you to remember this now, it went 7 in, but it did not cut through that building. That B-25, which was a heavier material, a heavier metal, did not cut through that building. That'll be very important to remember in just a moment. So the problem is that the first time that this happened was not 9/11. There were other events, and no other building fell the way that the 9/11 buildings fell. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. All right? Now we come to problem number 4. The Twin Towers were built to withstand airlines crashing into them. Now this is a very pivotal point right here. That's not my personal opinion. This was built to withstand a fully fueled Boeing 707 traveling at 600 miles an hour. The greatest engineering skills and represent the greatest contribution, that was the American Society of Civil Engineers. The outstanding civil engineer achievement. It was built to withstand a fully fueled Boeing 707 traveling at 600 miles an hour. It was designed for that. Whoever designed it utterly failed unless something else was at work. And it wasn't just those people that believed that. Someone very near and dear to our heart at the time could not understand why that was happening.
Builder, particularly of great buildings in the city, there's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation. And it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows, you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams. When I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747 or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
You know.
Do you see the problem with that? This was built to withstand what happened to it. So maybe it was a fluke. Maybe it happened just perfectly, but twice.
Yeah, that's right.
Twice. Let's go to our next problem. Everybody still with me?
Amen.
Problem number 5. How could the collapse be so perfectly symmetrical? It's very important. There's 110 floors, 287 columns per floor. Now, I'm not going to get you to do the math here, but 47 of the columns were in the core, 240 were on the perimeter. That's roughly 80% of the strength is on the outside where the planes hit. It had to go through the strongest part of the building, cut through 240, cut through that onto the other side and come out the other side. For the Twin Towers to collapse the way that it did, watch this now, each of the 60,000 connections would have had to disconnect at the same exact time. You can see here in a mock-up of the exterior, you can see that there's the strength there. Then the inner columns there. All of this on that level would have to collapse at the same time as the inner core is collapsing. It was not just something where it burned and then boom all of a sudden. And how many of us know that fire is not the most symmetrical at all time? A little movement here or there, here or there. All right? And let's go to the next problem. I'm just skimming across the top, some of these. Problem number 6, and I don't want to get too gory here, but I brought this book for you. I've got several books. You're more than welcome to take a look at them. This one is called Where Did the Towers Go? Probably one of the most fascinating books you'll ever read. But without being too gory, the real question has always been, where are the people? Where are all the people? In 2006, more than 700 human bone fragments were found across the street on the 40th Deutsche Bank building. In other words, they were finding human debris, which doesn't look that far on this sheet, on this slide here, but way further away than they should have. And he said, preacher, wait a second. The reason they didn't find any debris is because of the collapse. Yes, you're exactly right. The problem is collapsing things crush things. Exploding things disintegrate things. You should have found a lot more, and I want to be cautious with the group that we have, but there should have been a lot more bulk human debris found. There was nothing. Why? It's my hypothesis that they were not being crushed, they were being disintegrated almost floor by floor. Let's go to this.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
It collapsed to dust. But that flies in the face of what we're seeing. The forensic data is not showing crushing, it's showing disintegration. Let's go to the next problem. The next problem we face is, what were all those explosions? Now, the fact of the matter is, this is not for debate. What I'm showing you right here is not you can interpret it however you want, but the fact is there were multiple explosions. Rich Bianski here said, I just remember there was just an explosion. It seemed like on television, they blow up these buildings. One said, we heard 3 loud explosions. I heard 3 explosions. Another said it was weird how it started to come down. It looked like it was a timed explosion.
What happened?
We was in an explosion. We was in the lobby and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What was it like? What was it like?
Horrible.
It's like hell. You don't want to know.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the planet probably?
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion. But we was inside waiting to go upstairs, and on the way upstairs, the thing blew. And we just collapsed on everybody inside the lobby.
Similar to the first tower coming down, secondary?
I don't know about the first one, but I know the second one was terrible. Then there was a third one too after that one.
Third explosion after that?
That's right. Everybody was inside the building, waiting to go upstairs, and they just let loose. Everything just let loose inside the building. So.
Can we pause that and back it up just a minute? Do you mind if we back up and I show you something very quickly? Remember we talked about the size of the building? Go ahead, Brother Kevin. You can actually see the cone. How does it cut through that building? A normal plane. It's cutting through the building. Now, I'm just giving you a few of these, but over and over and over, the list goes on and on and on of people that heard explosion after explosion after explosion. Problem number 8. If the iron frame of the building was so hot from the jet fuel, why are there pictures of victims touching it? Now, everyone look at me for just a moment here. I will give you that maybe it was jet fuel that burned so hot and so long that it weakened both structures in a symmetrical point of view. But if that's the case, what is she doing there? What is he doing there? What are they doing there in the very spot where that plane hit? What are they doing there? We were told that where she's standing was so hot that it's melting the inside of that building. Is that not the narrative, yes or no?
Yeah.
What's she doing there? What's they doing? What are they doing there? What are they doing there? Doesn't add up, does it?
You'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
That's not jet fuel that melts. His stuff can. The boys in the military with their thermite and all of that, they can melt stuff. But jet fuel isn't going to do that. What was doing that? Whatever it was something other than jet fuel. Problem number 9. Why was the document vault of the U.S. Customs Office in Building 6 cleaned out prior to the attack? Now, this is a fact. It was cleaned out prior to the attack. Following the attacks of 9/11, FEMA photographer Kurt Sonnefeld descended into the wreckage of Building 6. Once inside, he made his way into the top secret document vault of the U.S. Customs Office. In his report about Building 6, he states that the vault was empty and supported the theory that there was foreknowledge to the attacks. Now, on January 1, his wife died by a gunshot to her head. He was charged with murder. He claims that she committed suicide and that the government is framing him. But our government doesn't do that. Only governments that infect people with STDs would do something like that. Let's go to the next one. Problem number 10. You wish you were back with that guy eating the steak, don't you, back in the Matrix? Problem number 10. What did witnesses really see at Shanksville? How many of you know what I'm talking about when I say Shanksville? Flight 93. Do I believe that there might have been that guy said, hey, let's roll? Absolutely. I'm not denigrating anything that happened. What I'm saying is that side by side, there were two events taking place. There were real heroes, real heroines, real people responding to a real world event the best that they knew how. But I'm saying behind the scenes, it sure doesn't look like there was some puppet mastery going on. Something was taking place. Maybe even counting on the heroes to respond the way that they did, so that all of America would stand on the front row, the front steps of the government and say, let's go to war, look at what they did to our finest. And we've never pulled back from that yet.
And you said afterwards you did see, what, 2 planes? Mm-hmm. And they were
real high, and they were just like silver triangles in this white triangles.
Okay, so
they were real shiny.
They didn't look like this, though.
No.
See,
I mean, they were real high, but they just looked like those. I would call it a fighter jet because that's what it looked like.
Yeah, with the wings back.
It was just
like a
triangle in the sky, and it was really high.
Okay, I wanted to clarify that because there's an article about you in American Free Press, and they said you identified the plane as being this here's an A-10 Thunderbolt. It's called a Warthog, and they actually said that you called the white plane, which you saw what we were talking about back there that went over that this was what flew over your van, according to you.
No.
I just wanted to clarify
look how
that.
small that area is. Okay, so I'm coming up here almost to the stop sign, and this, I keep calling it a plane for lack of any other, it came down. I mean, it was like right above my van, and right down over my windshield, because it was so low that I ducked in my van. And when I did, I shut off my radio. And that's when I knew there was no sound. And I said it out loud. I said it 2 times. Oh my God, it's going to crash. It's going to crash. It cleared those trees. So it, to my knowledge, it just seems to me it had to be below the power lines. Came in, swooped up, cleared those trees. It was fall, so it was full of leaves. No leaves moved on the trees. Nothing fell, because I kept thinking, you know, there should be like a disturbance, and it just smoothly went around. I went right over there, banked to the right, and crashed. Now you can't see where it crashed because you can't see through the trees, but I saw I heard the, well, I didn't hear the explosion that day. I don't know why. It was like about 2 days later before I, you know, but
You seem a little shaken up.
It does. It really upsets me.
What upsets you?
That it was such a horrible day. It was terrible. I thought we were going to die. It was pure white. There was not any markings on it. There was no rivets. I mean, it was that close that I could have seen it. It was so molded. It looked like it was all one piece. And it was cylinder. It came back. And then this spoiler was across it. And I remember the spoiler was so molded, and it was so white and shiny.
Okay, a couple things struck me about that. Number one, what struck me was she, to me, seems like a credible witness. Mm-hmm. She corrected herself because men and people that have been in traumatic events, she said, I heard, and then she goes, no, I didn't hear the explosion. And that's very credible to me because the shock and the trauma of seeing that, her mind was probably operating. It was later that she registered that, and she corrected herself and did that. The second thing that struck me was how choked up she was about that. I'm going to posit what I believe happened to Flight 93, but I believe that on Flight 93, those men and those women were bravely trying to take over what they thought was a hijacked plane. But I believe it's very possible that the government shot that plane down, either with a fighter up high and then, or very possibly topped it off with that cruise missile coming in over top to make sure that there was nothing left. But whatever that lady saw, she did not see a plane, not like a jet like you and I would see. She had the crash, and then she saw something else coming in over top. That's one witness. I could take you to dozens of witnesses that said, hey, we saw something different. But you and I are not privy to that. Here's the next problem very quickly. Building number 7 is the smoking gun. World Trade Center South. Okay, so it burned. World Trade Center North, it was hit by a plane, so it burned. Okay, maybe we meet you halfway and go, okay, sure, that might have happened. But how did World Trade Center number 7 collapse? It was not hit by a plane. It did not get hit with jet fuel. There is the South Tower. There is the North Tower. What you and I are told is that the fire was so vicious, somehow it jumped building 6, went in between the Verizon and the U.S. Post Office and hit World Trade Center number 7. And none of its sprinkler system worked because it was a regular fire. It was not hit with jet fuel, so it shouldn't have had a problem. None of its resistance that was designed to have worked. It just burned, not for an inordinately long period of time, and then it crashed at free fall speed. That is the smoking gun. What you're going to see here is information over here about that, and what you're going to see over here is that they were already talking about and announcing on BBC the fall of World Trade Center number 7, and the problem was she's still standing in the background.
De gebeurtenis heeft nooit veel aandacht gekregen en ook Denny Jowenko heeft er nooit van gehoord. Zijn reactie op de beelden die we laten zien is onbevangen.
Zie je vanaf boven gaan? Nee, je gaat vanaf onder.
Die gaat vanaf onder, ja.
Toch?
Ja.
Ze hebben gewoon kolommen weggeblazen. Er is nagesprongen.
Dit valt anders dan het World Trade Center.
Vind je niet dan?
Ja, je ziet het, de onderste verdiepingen gaan eerst.
Ja, en de rest zakt er gewoon in. Dus dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
Yeah, it was like there was a whole lot of commotion. The firefighters were picking up and they were starting to roll out and go follow these buses that went downtown. And the Red Cross rep was like, he goes over and he says, well, you got to stay behind this line because they're thinking about bringing the building down. They didn't say what building. They just said bringing a building down. So we're like, okay, you know, we'll take their word for it. You know, we'll stay behind the line. And he went over and he talked to one of the, through all the commotion, he goes over and he asked one of the Red Cross, or one of the firefighters, what was going on. I guess, I don't know if he got an answer or not. He came back over with his hand over the radio, and what sounded like a countdown. And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1, and he was just saying, just run for your life, just run for your life. And then it was like another 2, 3 seconds, you heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, much earlier today, because of, course, the dreadful collapse of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. But New York, very much a city still in chaos. The phones are not working properly, the subway lines are not working properly. And we know that down there near the World Trade Center, there are 3 schools that are being turned into triage centers for emergency treatment. And I know that over in New York Harbor, where the famous Statue of Liberty is.
Jane, I think many of us, when we heard the news, perhaps on the radio earlier today, were completely flabbergasted by it and just couldn't comprehend it. I mean, it almost sounded too far-fetched. I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan.
Next one, very, very quickly. The question is, what was actually in building number 7? Offices for the CIA, offices for the Secret Service, Emergency Commission, other major financials. Destroyed in building number 7 was thousands of files related to cases against companies like Enron and WorldCom. Now, a government would never do that. Our government would never do that. Only a government that would give innocent victims STDs would do that. Next one. One of the things that's fascinating to ask yourself is, were we warned? Did anybody know about this? The answer is absolutely yes. We were warned over and over and over. Did you know that many Pentagon officials canceled their travel plans between 9/10, 9/11? Not a few, a lot. Almost as if they knew something. Mayor Willie Brown and British author Salman Rushdie were warned not to fly on 9/11. There was an Israeli company that received a warning about attacks 2 hours before the attack took place, and the stocks of the United and American Airlines predicted to drop on 9/10. There was a lot of people that were making some money on this. But the interesting thing is, did Hollywood know? Is there some sort of spiritual connection going on? Notice the connectivity.
Oh, I'd love to see New York. We could all go with the bus company's special Super Sitter fare. $9? This one's on me.
Yeah. Did Hollywood know? It's very possible that they did. Let me go through very quickly. I just want to skim through a couple of these others. I'll be glad to give you these slides later on. The Project for a New American Century. How many of you have ever heard of that? If you want to raise your hand real quick. The project, you probably never heard of that. 1 year before 9/11 in September 2000, they published a paper, Rebuilding America's Defenses. This document included a passage that is chilling. Quote, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a Pearl Harbor. That's a neocon document. We need a Pearl Harbor to change America. We'll move on. But this walking cadaver, Larry Silverstein owned building number 7. He bought the World Trade Center's lease in June 2001. Silverstein took out an insurance plan that fortuitously covered terrorism. Silverstein took the insurance company to court claiming he should be paid double because there were 2 attacks. He won and was awarded, and I'll let you figure out that number. Go ahead to the next one. Now here's another problem we're just about through. How could poorly trained hijackers accomplish what they did? Flight 11 and 175 were heading to Boston instead of the several airports around in New York. This created 40 minutes of exposure to interception for each flight. They planned to give themselves 40 minutes of exposure. Why would you do that? Everybody knows that there are these triggers, military triggers. Why would they do that? One of the things I don't have on here, but on that day, NORAD was told to stand down. They were operating in another training facility. NORAD, who would normally handle something like this, was stood down. Flight 77 and 93 flew Midwest before turning around, leaving them exposed for 1.5 hours. Now, I want to say something very quickly. Let's go to the next one very quickly, and I'm trying to hurry. But the question is, what exactly happened on those planes? Not a single video of the 19 hijackers from the originating airports have been made public. Now, I want you to think for just a second. What was it that they used to kill the pilots or the co-pilots and the navigator? Remember what it was?
Box cutters.
Have you ever seen the cockpit of a plane? How do you fit 2 or 3 of those hijackers into that cockpit? There are at least 3 men in that cockpit. And yet not one single deviation of flight. In other words, you have a man walking in there trying to cut 3 people's throat with a box cutter, but that plane never loses altitude, never goes off course. There's never anything like that going on. Either these men were highly trained or something else was taking place in that cockpit that we're not privy to. Let's go to the next one. Now, I was trying to think of how best to explain the farcity of what we've done since 9/11. How many of the hijackers were Afghanistan? How many of them were Iraqi? There were 15 Saudi Arabian. Where did we go to war? Iraq. For weapons of mass destruction. Finally, we went to Afghanistan, never got Osama bin Laden until years down the road when a CIA, joint CIA and Navy SEAL operation raided. We shot him in the head and on a boat dumped his body overboard. Yes? The greatest criminal in the history of the United States of America, and there's not one outside of those in the know video proof that we ever actually did kill him. But we went to war and have gone to war all over it. I think Family Guy best describes what's going on with this.
Peter, this is the site of the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Oh, so Saddam Hussein did this?
No.
The Iraqi army?
No.
Some guys from Iraq?
No.
That one lady who visited Iraq that one time?
No, Peter, Iraq had nothing to do with this. It was a bunch of Saudi Arabians, Lebanese, and Egyptians financed by a Saudi Arabian guy living in Afghanistan and sheltered by Pakistanis.
So you're saying we need to invade Iran?
No, we don't need to invade Iran. We don't need to invade Iraq. But where have we been? What has happened to our country since then? It has changed the world upside down. Last slide and we're through. The question is, what is the takeaway? I don't think you should try to fight your government. I think if you try to fight government, you're going to find yourself in a cell with other weird people just like yourself.
Or dead.
I don't think you can fight government. Or dead. I told Brother Kevin and Brother Rich this week, I said, listen, the brakes on my car work well. I'm not suicidal. No, no, you can't fight government. You're not going to be able to. But I do think that you can hold the world more loosely. The Bible says that we're not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind, and that we're to prove all things. And I'm going to tell you something, ladies and gentlemen. I think we live in very, very, very strange times. And when you look at what's going on, I think 9/11 was a dual thing. I think on one hand, there were brave men and women that did great things. But I think on the other hand, there was exactly what the PRAN plan did. The New America. We needed a Pearl Harbor to make you accept being felt up when you go through the plane line. To make you accept being pulled over and searched without cause. To make you accept warrantless wiretapping. To make you accept us do what we want to do around the world. To get America to fall in line, we needed a modern Pearl Harbor. I think that that's what 9/11 is. As Christians, you got to hold this world loosely because it is coming to an end. As Christian Americans, you need to wake up and get out of your lethargy. We may be facing harder times than we think.